In a quiet suburban neighborhood in Texas, a heartbreaking story unfolds. James Carter, a jealous husband, believes he's protecting his marriage by killing his wife's beloved German Shepherd, Zeus. But what happens next will leave you speechless. What if the loyalty of a dog could teach us more about love, trust, and redemption than we ever imagined? How far can forgiveness go after betrayal? Stay tuned as we dive into this emotional roller coaster of love, loss, and a twist you won't see coming. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Share it with friends and family, and make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an emotional moment from our channel. Thank you for being part of our amazing community. In a quiet suburb of Texas, life at the Carter household seemed ordinary. Rachel and James Carter lived a typical life. Busy schedules, long work hours, and a beautiful German Shepherd named Zeus. For Rachel, 32, Zeus was more than just a dog. He was her companion, her comfort on lonely days when James worked late, and the one constant presence in the house when everything else felt distant. One evening, James came home earlier than expected. He walked into the living room and froze. Rachel was asleep on the couch, her hand resting gently on Zeus's fur. The large dog lay quietly beside her, protective and calm. To most people, it would have been a sweet scene, a tired woman finding comfort in her loyal dog. But James didn't see it that way. His eyes lingered on them, and a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Why does she need the dog so much? Am I not enough anymore? Zeus noticed James and wagged his tail in greeting. But James's thoughts had already taken a darker turn. Rachel stirred and opened her eyes. Seeing James, she smiled. "Hey, you're home early." James nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just finished up." But inside, something didn't feel right. He couldn't shake the image of Rachel and Zeus together. And in that moment, a seed of suspicion was planted, one that would soon grow into something much bigger than either of them could imagine. The next morning, the air in the Carter house was heavy. James sat at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee. Across the room, Rachel made breakfast, while Zeus lay quietly at her feet, watching her every move. Finally, James broke the silence. "Don't you think you're a little too close to that dog?" Rachel stopped what she was doing. "What do you mean?" James frowned. "You're always with him, Rachel. Sleeping next to him, spending all your time with him. It's weird." Rachel sighed. "James, Zeus is part of the family. He's been a big help since you've been working late so often." But James wasn't convinced. "It doesn't feel right, like something's going on." Rachel took a deep breath. "Zeus used to belong to Mark, my friend who passed away last year." James looked up, remembering Mark's sudden death. Zeus loved Mark. When Mark died, Zeus was heartbroken. "I took him in because he needed someone. And honestly, I needed him too," Rachel explained softly. James folded his arms. "So, it's not just about the dog. It's about Mark." Rachel nodded. "Yes, we've both been healing together." James was quiet for a moment, but the doubt stayed in his mind. "He's just a dog, Rachel. Don't let him come between us." Rachel's eyes softened. "James, you're my husband. No one could ever replace you." But James didn't seem to believe her. The thought of Zeus being so close to Rachel made him uncomfortable. Over the next few days, things got worse. James grew more distant, watching Zeus like he was an intruder. Zeus, unaware of the growing tension, stayed by Rachel's side, offering her the love and comfort she needed. But all James saw was a dog taking his place. What will James do next? And how far will his jealousy go? Stay with us. to find out. The tension in the house kept growing. James couldn't stand the sight of Rachel sitting with Zeus anymore. Every time he saw them together, his anger and jealousy got worse. One evening, James came home, his mind filled with frustration. Rachel was on the couch, leaning against Zeus, her hand gently stroking his fur. James couldn't hold it in anymore. "Rachel, I'll take Zeus for a walk," he said abruptly. Rachel looked surprised. "Really? That's nice. He could use some fresh air." James forced a smile. "Yeah, it's time I did." Zeus wagged his tail, excited to go outside. He trusted James completely. They walked through the quiet streets and into a wooded area. The night was calm, with only the sound of their footsteps. Zeus happily trotted beside James, unaware of the storm brewing in his mind. James stopped in a dark clearing, his hands shaking. "This is for us. For our marriage," he whispered, his voice filled with anger and confusion. In a moment of blind rage, James did something he would regret forever. The night grew quiet again. Zeus, the loyal friend who only knew love, lay still. James stood there, breathing heavily, thinking it was over. Now things will be better, he told himself. But as he walked back home, guilt started to creep in. It felt heavy, making each step harder. When he got home, Rachel noticed right away. "Where's Zeus?" she asked, worried. He ran off," James lied, unable to meet her eyes. "Ran off? Zeus never does that." Rachel's voice shook with fear. She quickly grabbed her coat and rushed outside, calling for him. "Zeus! Zeus! Where are you?" Her voice echoed in the empty streets, but there was no sign of him. Hours passed. Zeus didn't come back. The next morning, Rachel sat by the window, her eyes swollen from crying. "Something's wrong, James. Zeus wouldn't just leave like that," she said softly, her heart breaking. James looked away, guilt weighing heavily on him. "He'll come back, I'm sure," he said. Though he knew the truth, Rachel's heart was shattered, and James began to realize that his jealousy might have cost him everything. After Zeus was gone, Rachel couldn't move on. She barely ate or spoke, spending most of her days staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. James would try to talk to her, but she never responded. She seemed so distant. "Rachel, please eat something," James asked one night, placing food in front of her. She shook her head. "I'm not hungry," she said quietly. James sighed, feeling the weight of his guilt. He knew he couldn't fix this, but he wished he could. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Zeus wasn't just a dog. He was my friend." James couldn't say anything back. He felt so broken inside, but instead of talking, he kept everything to himself. The guilt was eating away at him, and every day felt harder. As the days passed, James started noticing strange things happening around the house. One night, he heard barking outside, but it didn't sound like a neighbor's dog. It sounded like Zeus. "Rachel," he called, but she was in another room, sleeping. He stood up and looked around the house, but everything seemed normal. Still, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching him. Then, another strange thing happened. James found the living room rug moved, as if something had dragged it. A photo of Rachel and Zeus had fallen from the shelf. The glass cracked. "Must have been the wind," he muttered. But the windows were closed. The next night, as he worked on his laptop, he felt a sudden cold chill in the room. He turned to look, and for a split second, he saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. "Just tired," he told himself. But as he turned back to his laptop, he heard a noise behind him, a soft thud. He turned around slowly. There on the floor was Zeus's collar. He'd put it away in a drawer after Zeus disappeared. How did it end up there? His heart raced, and he felt a cold sweat on his skin. Zeus, he whispered, afraid of what he might be feeling. The house was silent, but James couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was there. The strange things kept happening. The barking, the shadow, the collar. James couldn't ignore it anymore. He knew deep down that Zeus was still with him. And every night, the guilt grew stronger. He couldn't escape the thought of what he'd done. Was Zeus here to forgive him? Or was there something else? In an attempt to heal from the heartbreak, Rachel decided it was time to bring home a new companion. She had been so lost in grief since Zeus's death, and she knew it was time to take a step forward. One afternoon, Rachel drove to the animal shelter, hoping to find a dog who might bring some comfort. It wasn't an easy decision, but she knew Zeus would want her to heal. After hours of searching, she found a German Shepherd puppy with a striking black and gray coat. She named him Shadow. When Rachel brought Shadow home, James wasn't sure how to feel. He couldn't deny that he felt uneasy about replacing Zeus, but he didn't say anything. He'd been distant from Rachel ever since Zeus's death, and bringing in another dog only made the distance between them feel larger. Shadow, however, didn't seem like just any puppy. From the moment he stepped into the house, he moved with confidence. There was an eerie, almost wise look in his eyes that made James uncomfortable. At first, James thought it was just his own guilt making him paranoid, but Shadow's behavior quickly caught his attention. For one, Shadow was unusually intelligent for his age. He seemed to understand everything Rachel said to him. He would stay close to Rachel, watching her carefully, as if protecting her from something unseen. But what really made James uneasy was how Shadow would often act, as if he was looking for something or someone. At night, Shadow would sit near the door, staring at the spot where Zeus's collar had once been kept, as if waiting for a sign. Most disturbingly, Shadow displayed behaviors that reminded James too much of Zeus. He would sit in the exact same way Zeus had, by the window, staring outside. He would bark at the same time of day, as if responding to a sound only he could hear. Rachel, though, was grateful for Shadow. He followed her everywhere, staying close by her side, as though he was protecting her from the world. Shadow quickly became her constant companion, keeping her calm during the hardest days. But Shadow was distant from James. The puppy would never approach him, instead retreating whenever James tried to get close. The bond between Shadow and Rachel was undeniable, and James began to feel like an outsider in his own home. It was as if Shadow was telling him something that made James feel even more uncomfortable with the presence of the dog. As the days passed, James began to question whether he had made a mistake by killing Zeus. But it was too late. Shadow's presence only reminded him of the irreversible damage he'd caused. There was something in Shadow's eyes, something that reminded him of Zeus. James couldn't shake the feeling that the new dog wasn't just here to fill the space Zeus left behind. It was almost as if Shadow had come to accomplish something far greater, something that would change everything. As days passed, James couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was off about Shadow. The new puppy, once full of playful energy, seemed to grow quieter and more observant with each passing day. James first noticed it one evening, when he was sitting in the living room. Shadow was lying on the floor, but his eyes were fixed on James, unblinking, almost as if he were studying him. It was the kind of gaze that made James feel like Shadow could see right through him, like he was calculating something. Then, the strange accidents began. It started small. James tripped over a loose rug that he was sure had been fine earlier. The next day, he found the basement door locked, when he was certain he hadn't locked it. Later that week, he almost got into a car accident, when the brakes in the garage seemed to malfunction at the last second, causing him to swerve and narrowly avoid a collision with the garage wall. Each time something unusual happened, James couldn't help but feel like it wasn't just bad luck. It felt deliberate, like Shadow was somehow orchestrating these small mishaps, almost as if the dog was trying to warn him or make him feel uneasy. One night, James decided to test his suspicions. He was sitting in the kitchen, having a late-night snack, when Shadow came in and sat down by the door. James had left his phone on the counter, and as he stood up to get it, he noticed that the door to the living room was slightly ajar. It had been completely shut earlier. Feeling a chill run down his spine, James slowly walked toward the door, his heart pounding. Just as he reached for the handle, Shadow suddenly stood up and growled lowly, his body tensing. James froze. Was it possible that the dog was actually aware of him, following his every move, manipulating the situation around him? That night, James couldn't sleep. Every time he tried to close his eyes, he felt like Shadow was watching him from the corner of the room, his eyes glinting in the darkness. When Rachel found James the next morning, pale and exhausted, she didn't understand what had him so upset. He tried to explain the strange occurrences, but Rachel simply shook her head. "You're just imagining things," she said softly. "You're feeling guilty, and it's affecting your mind. Shadow is just a puppy. He's probably acting like this because he's adjusting to the new house." But James couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow was up to something more than just adjusting. There was something behind those eyes, a hidden intelligence that seemed to be plotting something James didn't understand. He tried to brush off his fears, but the tension in the house kept building. Every little thing felt like a sign, a warning. Shadow was always there, silently observing, waiting for something to happen. And James couldn't escape the nagging thought. What if Shadow wasn't just a puppy? What if Shadow had come for something far more important than just companionship? It was a restless night. James tossed and turned in bed, his mind racing with thoughts of Shadow and the strange occurrences. His guilt, never fully gone, had begun to creep up on him again. Every strange noise, every small accident felt like a reminder of the dog he had killed, a reminder that he couldn't escape. As the night wore on, sleep finally overtook him, but it was a sleep filled with turmoil. In his dream, James found himself standing in a vast, empty field. The air was still, the sky a dull gray, and the ground beneath him felt soft, almost as if he were walking on clouds. He felt disoriented, unsure of where he was. But he wasn't alone. There, in the distance, stood Zeus. The German shepherd was sitting calmly, his eyes soft but wise, his body relaxed, as if he had been waiting for James to find him. The moment their eyes met, James's heart dropped. "Zeus," he whispered, his voice trembling. Zeus's tail gave a slow, gentle wag. But he didn't move closer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, almost as if studying James, waiting for him to understand. In that moment, James felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. The pain, the regret, the guilt of what he had done to the dog he once loved. He opened his mouth to apologize. But before he could speak, Zeus raised his paw, stopping him. "You don't need to apologize, James," Zeus's voice echoed in his mind, soothing yet firm. "I forgive you." James stood frozen, not sure if he was hearing things, but the words felt real, as if Zeus himself were speaking to him. "I understand now," Zeus continued, his voice carrying a sense of wisdom and clarity. "You acted out of fear, and fear makes people do things they regret. But love is something different." Zeus's eyes softened, and he stood up, walking closer to James. He nuzzled his hand, and James felt the warmth of the dog's body against his skin. I never held any anger towards you, James, Zeus said, his voice gentle. But love and loyalty once betrayed come with consequences. It's not for me to punish, but it is for you to make things right. James felt his chest tighten, tears welling up in his eyes. He had never understood how much Zeus had meant to Rachel, how deeply the bond between them had gone. The guilt that had plagued him for so long seemed to weigh him down even more now, and he fell to his knees. I was wrong, James whispered, his voice breaking. I never should have done that. I thought I was protecting us, but I only hurt you. Zeus's eyes softened even more, and the pain James felt seemed to lift just slightly, as though the dog's presence was giving him permission to feel remorse, but also to heal. I know you didn't mean it, Zeus replied, but healing begins with understanding. You have to show Rachel and yourself that you can be better, that the love you once destroyed can be rebuilt. The dream began to fade, and James found himself standing alone in the field again. But this time, a sense of peace lingered. He could feel Zeus's presence, not as a ghost, but as a message that had been delivered. James woke up with a start, his heart pounding, and sweat beading on his forehead. The dream had felt so real, like Zeus had spoken directly to him. For a moment, he lay still in the dark, trying to process the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just a dream. It was a revelation. Zeus had forgiven him, but now it was up to James to make things right. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he moved forward. The guilt would always be there, but it didn't have to consume him. As James sat up in bed, he glanced over at the sleeping Shadow, who lay quietly at the foot of the bed. The dog's cold, calculating eyes from earlier seemed to soften now. The presence of both dogs, the one who had died and the one who had come in his place, was more than coincidence. It was a sign, and James knew it was time to start making amends. The tension in the house had been building for days. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that Shadow wasn't just any dog. There were moments when the dog's eyes seemed too knowing, his behavior too calculated. James had tried to brush it off, convincing himself it was just his guilty mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something sinister was unfolding. One evening, as the night crept in, James found himself alone in the basement. He'd been down there, rummaging through old boxes, trying to fix things around the house, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the strange dream and the message from Zeus. He was starting to feel as though Shadow's behavior had somehow connected to it all, but he couldn't piece it together. Suddenly the lights flickered. James froze. A heavy silence filled the room. But then, the unmistakable sound of scratching echoed from the far corner of the basement. His heart raced. He turned towards the source of the noise, but saw nothing. Bark. It was low at first, but then louder, more urgent. James's pulse quickened. As the sound grew closer, the footsteps growing louder with each passing second. He turned, hoping to see nothing, to hear nothing, but the door behind him slammed shut, trapping him in the darkness. His breath hitched as he stumbled back, the realization crashing over him. Shadow had locked him in. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the tension James had been feeling for weeks. He could hear the distinct sound of paws, padding softly on the floor, the approach of the dog, and then, there he was. Shadow stood in the doorway, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. His stance was unnervingly calm, but there was something else, something far more sinister, about the way he moved. It was as though he had orchestrated every moment to lead to this. James's breath caught in his throat. What? What are you doing? Shadow didn't answer. He simply stepped forward, his movements deliberate, calculated. Every step seemed to echo, reverberating through James's mind like the ticking of a clock. Suddenly, James heard another noise, the sound of nails clicking against the floor, more footsteps coming closer. And then, James realized, it wasn't just Shadow. It was Zeus. The presence of the dog, dead, yet very much alive in this moment, seemed to fill the room. James's heart skipped a beat as he looked at Shadow, who locked eyes with him, his gaze intense. There was a deep, knowing sadness in those eyes. Shadow wasn't just carrying out his own plan. He was carrying out Zeus's. James stepped back, his hands shaking. No, I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't mean to. But Shadow remained silent, watching, waiting for James to fully grasp the gravity of what had happened. The dog wasn't acting on his own emotions. He was acting on the pain and the betrayal Zeus had endured. And now the consequences were unfolding. In that moment, James realized that he wasn't the one in control anymore. Shadow had taken the reins, and Zeus's spirit had guided him all along. There was no escaping it. The sound of barking grew louder, and the room seemed to close in on James. He turned to try and escape, but the door wouldn't budge. He could hear Zeus's voice in his mind again. That message of forgiveness, now tinged with something darker. Love and loyalty, once betrayed, come with consequences. James sank to the floor, his heart heavy with regret. He had been given a chance to make things right, but he had failed. And now, it was too late. The plan was set in motion, and there was no way out. The air in the basement was thick with fear, as James crouched against the cold floor, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the room closing in on him, the shadows of betrayal and guilt threatening to consume him entirely. Shadow stood before him, his posture rigid, eyes locked on James with a piercing intensity. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the distant sound of Zeus's bark, echoing in James's mind. But just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the basement creaked open. Rachel stepped into the dim light, her face unreadable. She had been searching for James for hours, ever since he'd stormed off earlier that evening. The events had been unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she felt a growing sense of urgency. But now, seeing her husband crumpled in fear before her, her heart softened with understanding. James? Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. She walked over to him, her gaze briefly meeting Shadow's calm, unwavering stare. James looked up, his face pale, his eyes wild with fear. Rachel, please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt him. Zeus, or you. It wasn't what I thought. His voice trembled as he spoke, his mind struggling to make sense of everything that had occurred. Rachel knelt beside him, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. I know, James, she said softly. I know you didn't mean to. But you have to understand something. She looked at Shadow, who sat quietly by her side, his gaze shifting between her and James, almost as though he was listening to her every word. Shadow hasn't been trying to hurt you, Rachel continued. He's been trying to teach you. You've been so consumed by jealousy, by fear of losing me, that you've forgotten the most important thing of all, love and trust. James blinked, his confusion deepening. What do you mean? I thought he was getting revenge for Zeus. Rachel shook her head. No, James, this isn't about revenge. It never was. Shadow was Zeus's best friend, and after Zeus's death, I knew he was grieving. But Shadow also knew something. He knew you were lost in your own insecurities. He wanted to make you see what your jealousy, your anger, your actions were doing. Rachel's voice softened further as she added, It's not about Shadow getting back at you. It's about you understanding the consequences of your choices. Shadow, just like Zeus, has been showing you what happens when you break trust, when you let fear and jealousy control your heart. James looked at Shadow, his eyes welling up with guilt. Shadow's calm eyes met his, as though forgiving him without words, but James could see it. There was a deep sadness there, a sadness that came from witnessing betrayal, even in a family. "You mean you both were trying to teach me?" James whispered, the realization sinking in. He felt a wave of regret wash over him, but also something else, something powerful. Understanding. Rachel nodded, her eyes softening. "Yes, love and loyalty are the foundation of everything. Our relationships, our bonds, even the way we care for those who are different from us. Shadow's been showing you that. And Zeus's spirit, in his own way, has been guiding him." James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his guilt pressing on his chest. But there was also a sense of clarity now. The torment, the fear, the anger, all of it was starting to melt away, replaced by a deep, aching realization of what he had done. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. I never saw it like this. I never knew how much I hurt you. And Zeus, and even Shadow." Rachel smiled gently, lifting his chin so he could meet her eyes. "I know, James, and I believe you now. You've learned a hard lesson, but it's not too late to make things right. The question is, will you?" For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of their shared understanding filling the room. Shadow, now calmer than ever, slowly approached James and sat by his side, his eyes still full of wisdom. James looked at Rachel, his heart full of remorse, but also a glimmer of hope. He reached out a hand, slowly but with sincerity, and Shadow placed his paw in it. "I will. I'll make it right. I promise." Rachel nodded, her heart swelling with relief. She knew they still had a long way to go, but this was the first step toward healing, toward restoring the trust that had been broken. And in that moment, Shadow seemed to approve, sitting back and watching over them with quiet pride. The lesson had been learned, and the road to redemption had begun. Months passed since the night in the basement, and the house had finally started to feel whole again. The eerie atmosphere that once lingered had dissolved, replaced by a new sense of peace, albeit one that had been hard-earned. James sat on the back porch, looking out over the garden where Shadow lay in the grass, his coat glistening in the morning sun. The wind gently rustled the trees, and there was a stillness in the air that felt right, natural. It had taken time for everything to heal, for the wounds to begin closing, but there was something undeniable in the air, a sense of forgiveness, of renewal. Rachel came outside, her steps soft against the wooden deck. Her face still held traces of the pain from the past, but her eyes were different now. There was light in them, something she had been missing for so long. James looked up at her, a deep sorrow in his gaze. "Rachel, I can never say it enough. I'm sorry. For everything." She smiled faintly and sat down beside him. Her hand reached for his, and he took it with a quiet but thankful grasp. There was a weight to her words as she spoke, but it wasn't heavy anymore. "I know, James. I know." She paused for a moment, watching Shadow chase after a butterfly in the yard. "When Zeus died, I didn't just lose a dog. I lost my best friend, my companion. I felt so alone. But I never stopped loving you, even when you made it so hard." James's heart twisted at her words. He felt the sting of his past mistakes, the anger, the jealousy that had clouded his vision. "I was so blind, so consumed by fear. I thought I was losing you, Rachel. I thought I had to fight for you. But I lost sight of what truly mattered." Rachel turned to him, her eyes gentle but firm. "The hardest part wasn't what you did, James. The hardest part was watching you not see what was in front of you. The love, the trust, the bond we had built. It was all there, and yet you let fear take over. James lowered his head in shame, but there was no anger in her voice, just the quiet wisdom that came from understanding the deeper pain they had both endured. He could feel the truth of her words in his bones. The love they had shared, the life they had built together, it had all been so fragile, and he had nearly destroyed it. But, Rachel continued, her voice full of warmth, "You've shown me something, James. You've shown me that you want to change, that you're willing to try, and that's all I ever wanted. To see you see the truth." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I see it now, Rachel. I see it all. The jealousy, the assumptions. I can't take it back, but I can do better. I will do better." Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with the hope that she hadn't felt in so long. "I know you will." A quiet moment passed between them, filled with understanding. Shadow trotted up to them, his tail wagging, and nudged his head into James's lap. For a brief second, James hesitated, unsure if he could accept the unconditional loyalty Shadow was offering him. But then he lowered his hand, stroking the dog's fur gently, feeling the bond that had been forged between them. "I'm sorry, Shadow," James whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I never meant to hurt you or Zeus. I was lost. I didn't know how to see what was right in front of me." Shadow gazed up at him, his eyes wise, calm. It wasn't an apology James needed to hear. It was the understanding that was now shared between them. The past couldn't be undone. But this moment was real. "You've learned," Rachel said softly, "and we've learned together. Trust isn't something that just happens. It's earned. But love is always there, even when we forget." James nodded, taking in her words. There would be more healing to do, more changes to be made, but they were on the right path now. Shadow, standing proudly beside them, was the reminder of the lesson that had come at a great cost. Rachel squeezed James's hand, the bond between them more solid than it had been in months. "We'll rebuild this, James. We'll rebuild it, step by step. And this time, we won't forget what really matters." As they sat together, the sun began to set in the distance, painting the sky with hues of gold and orange. There was something peaceful about the moment, something that felt like the beginning of something new. Shadow lay down beside them, content and at ease. James leaned back, his arm around Rachel, and whispered to himself, "Love is pure, loyalty is eternal, and assumptions can destroy everything. But even in the darkest moments, redemption is possible when we learn to see the truth." And for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. What a roller coaster of emotions. James learned the hard way that trust, love, and loyalty are the foundation of any relationship, and that sometimes it takes a loyal friend to open our eyes. But it doesn't end here. The power of love, forgiveness, and second chances is something we should all remember. So, what do you think about this incredible story? Can we ever truly make up for our mistakes? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out. Until next time, remember, love always finds a way.